talk about stress and trauma, there's some real truth to that. And I have spoken to young women of color who have said they don't know if they want to try to get pregnant because they see that something is wrong when our city is leading the nation in infant mortality, and they don't want to put themselves at risk. So that's heartbreaking, you know, to think about that. And then I would just add that we all know that the majority of the households in places like Cleveland are headed by women. So they do have to go home and then take care of the kids and do all of that. So just think about the stress of that. You know, you go to work and you're fighting for your life, and you don't know who you can trust, and you don't feel protected, and you don't have mentors, and then you come home and you have kids, you have, you know, you're trying to make the bills work, you know, health, I mean, everything. So it is a heavy burden, and I appreciate you bringing that up, and it's something that we should try to support however we can.
I hope we can, you know, if there are organizations or methods that you can share with us, I think it would be a helpful follow-up.
Very good.
Hello, I just wanted to put it to you both. In your studies, have you come across, well, can you talk about the special burden that an immigrant might be under at this time?
I would have to defer.
Yeah.
The gentleman from
Where do you start? I think at maybe the softest level is, I think about my own international students. And I was an international student for 10 years. So you have folks who, you know, want to come to this country and learn and come to a place like Case Western Reserve University, and they know that they probably won't be able to get a job in this country, which, and again, that's sort of the softest burden I can think of, right? But it's still a struggle, right? Because you've had to get over here, adjust to a new place, to winter, you know, go through a rigorous program of study, and then know, really with the current administration, the reduction in H-1B visas means that, you know, the opportunities, the way of life that you imagined being possible are now constrained. And so that definitely affects students and their outlook in terms of the potential for, you know, what do I do with this degree, right? Now that I'm in debt. So again, that's sort of the softest burden I can think of. I think a sort of maybe a harsher burden is that psychological burden as well of being fair. And I remember that. I mean, I'm going to date myself, but I was a sophomore when 9/11 happened. I remember somebody coming into the classroom saying this happened, and I was in Baltimore, so not that far from the Pentagon. And you know, you knew that, okay, all F1 visa holders are now on a list. And you knew that. You knew that you're being sort of somewhat tracked, as I think any visa holder would be, but you knew that there was a greater level of scrutiny. You knew that, you know, there was less leeway to make mistakes. And of course, you know, you hope people want to do the right thing, but I think that sense of being monitored, that sense of, you know, of risk, I guess is one word that comes to mind. And that's a psychic burden, right? To walk around every day thinking, do I have my I's dotted and T's crossed, and you know, I'm on my P's and Q's, and I think to then have to also just operate as normally as you can in the world, which is still a foreign world to you, I think is just challenging. So I think the fact that it's been in the news and is in the news heightens that sense of anxiety, and certainly, I don't know if the data's come out, but in terms of how that affects academic performance, work performance for immigrants in the workplace, I can only imagine that is the case. So those are just a few things that come to mind, but I know there's a host of other issues that folks can think about.
Well, ditto.
Sort of two questions, but one. I'm a wordy, I'm a writer, a former journalist. Words are important to me. Tone, style, blah, blah. Okay, so that's my preface. So, what I hear both of you saying is that a common language needs to be found, discovered, interactively approached. And to me, common language means lowest common denominator, all in low caps. It's just that kind of stuff. So that's part of my question. Is that right? Do we need to be spending more time developing the lowest common denominator vocabulary so we can grow from there? That's pretty much yes, no.
Yes.
Oh,
I don't know.
oh, okay.
I might disagree.
And the second part of this is just a perception that I've gotten from listening to you about there's no downtime for people who are interested in this kind of stuff to do it. Yes, no.
Correct.
It's not, those aren't actually questions, they're just perceptions I gained from attending this program. Thank you very much.
I'll just say, the reason I say that there needs to be a common language is, I've had it up to here with I've been in probably thousands of meetings where people have talked about, we gotta do better, we gotta do this, and even when you're in the room with well-meaning people, you see those people a month later, 6 months later, a year later, and you realize nothing has changed. Everyone sort of has a different perspective of what success looks like, or what they thought the meeting was all about, or and not to digress, but it reminds me of when the city of Cleveland was talking a lot about economic development, and all of the civic mothers and fathers got together, and when they asked the question, what does economic development mean, they came up with about 15 different responses. And then when they said, well, who does economic development, they came up with a list of 30 or 40 organizations. And so from that point on, it's been like pulling teeth to get any traction, because everyone has sort of different perspectives and angles and viewpoints. So I think not that it will be easy, but if we could sort of bring people to a place where they really understand what words mean as it relates to diversity and inclusion, and we started out saying that those words are confusing and everyone defines them differently, but what does it really mean? I think it gets more to experiences and people understanding how people feel. Back to your point, I wrote it down, how do you make each other feel? That's the first thing I wrote down from your comment. I mean, that's the real question, because you can talk diversity and inclusion, but it's really at the end of the day, how do you make me feel? So I don't think it's a bad idea to look at language in a way that might help to address this.
Okay, and I was jumping because I think we both started off our presentations differentiating between diversity and inclusion. So obviously we both care about language. You brought up equity versus equality. Right. Language, I mean, words are my trade as well. Language is key. What I disagreed with was the lowest common denominator. Maybe I didn't like how it sounded, but I think certainly the common thread, we have to take time to find that common thread. But I would then lift that up, right? So not just what is it that we can all agree on, or what is it that we have common experience with, or what common experience can we create as a base if we don't have common experiences historically. But then when we find that commonality, a set of commonalities, how do we lift that up? How do we make a big deal out of that? We may think it's really small, right? That somebody grew up on the same street or shopped at the same store, or that, their grandparents went to the same school, as it was being integrated, or, as we collect stories of things that seem really innocuous, but that still connect us, how do we lift those things up so that they become a big deal. I think that's where the work is, to how do we celebrate those things, so it's not just laying at the lowest. I know that's not what you meant, but you know, the things that may seem trivial, how can we notice them and then lift them up? I think the other thing in terms of downtime, I agree that there is no downtime. It's a daily practice, like you were saying, about connecting. You know, I study something called high quality connections, and this idea of what dimensions are there of that moment when we're interacting, when we make each other feel seen and heard and valued. So to me, that's where there is no downtime, right? Because you're constantly thinking about, how am I making this other person feel? How am I treating them? How are they treating me? And I think those micro moments are really, really important, because that's what you need to do when you leave this place, right? So you can go to church, go to a service, but that's, to me at least, in my spiritual practice and belief, that's just a sort of booster shot for the rest of the week, right? It's what do I do when I leave this building? How do I treat people when I leave this building? How do I actually put into practice these things? So in that sense, there's no downtime, but I think there is still renewal with events like this, with communities with support. I don't think that we're designed to do this all by ourselves. So yes, there's stress, yes, there's a burden, yes, it feels like there's no downtime, but I do think if we find good ways to do this collectively, we can persist.
Last question.
I'm trying to address this from the bottom up. And I think everyone in this room is here because they value at least the concepts of diversity. But from the bottom up, from my perspective, is about inclusion. And I think we all have to ask ourselves, how diverse are the guests at our dinner table, at our birthday parties, at our children's weddings? I think it's probably fairly safe to assume that most of the people in this room live in diverse communities and have neighbors who are in some way different. And are you inviting your neighbor to your table? Are you developing intimate friendships? So I think it's super important.
I'll just, in terms of daily practice, like I have to ask, I love that you brought up those questions, because they're questions about our everyday. And I think in terms of getting out of a bubble or the bubble, you do have to step back and look at yourself. And I have to do that. So for instance, I'm teaching a course on leading organizations, and I'm trying to get guest speakers for this undergrad course. And in doing so, and looking at, okay, who can I ask, and like who's easiest to ask, I step back and realize, oh, these are mainly white men. That's just the network that I'm in terms of who I was like, but that's not what I want to present to my class. Sure. But that means more work for me, right? That means like, oh, I need to sort of think of this, I need to ask this person, I need to ask for an introduction to this person. But it's at least trying to hold myself accountable to what I say I care about. So even that small, like, you know, what are the faces and types of people that I want to present to this, you know, class of 45 students, and saying, okay, and making the commitment to put in that work. Because if I took the easier path, I would end up with a certain set of people. So it's just those little questions and just reflecting like, oh, that's what I'm doing. Because I don't think it's about intention. I don't think anybody means to do anything. I don't think we're at a point. I think there is a present minority in the country that does have explicit views of hate and prejudice. But I think for the most part, people are moving through the world with fairly decent intentions, but they don't realize that there are certain structures that are set up that entrain us along particular paths. So you need to question those structures and say, well, what can I do differently? So that's kind of it.
Randy, you continue to amaze me with your ability to work at the executive business level, policy, and then with Ridall and all of that. We've been researching some of the past of Cleveland's racial history and realized that in the 19th century, there were very strong relationships between blacks and whites and very integrated communities. It was with the mass migration and Jim Crow that things started to evolve differently until we have now a city in Cleveland with a large proportion of very poor, primarily African Americans. As you look at leadership in Cleveland, what are your recommendations for how to bring the leadership from those who live in Cleveland and struggle with economic issues to really helping Cleveland find the leaders it needs for the future?
Well, that was partly my goal in writing the Missing in Action report, and to a great extent it has been accomplished because a lot of emerging leaders felt that they couldn't step out and start to own important leadership posts because they had to sort of get permission from others. And so I tried to, that's why I spelled out that there's 4 different categories of leadership that the community should think about. There's business leadership, there's civic leadership, there's political leadership, and business, civic, political, and community. Thank you. So people can sort of find where they fit in one of those 4 buckets and then apply themselves as best they can to sort of demand that they can play a role in addressing whatever issues. Up until that report was released, I don't believe that people really thought about it that way. Community leaders, as I say in the report, have to understand that it's in their best interest to at least know who the civic leaders are and to try to interface with civic leaders. And one of the recommendations at the end was, in a perfect world, we would have leaders from all of those sectors coming together to kind of compare notes, because the elected officials don't understand and have all the answers, neither do the business leaders, neither do the civic leaders, and the community leaders need to know that not everyone's their enemy, you know. So I think if we could somehow figure out a way to bring those groups together and to have open dialogue and to learn from each other, that we could ultimately get to a place where we would at least start to see improved outcomes. I just think that we have to hold on firm to that and push all leaders to understand that it's not about the bubble that you're in, it's about the whole. And you won't understand the whole and the gravity of the challenges that people on the ground struggling to survive every day in Cleveland are faced with if you're not talking to them, hearing from them, learning from them. And I think sometimes, you know, as a corporate leader or a civic leader, you know, I've been on 5 or 6 or 7, you know, foundation boards. You know, I'm a corporate grant maker. You know, I can see where people start to believe the hype and think that they have it all figured out. And well, you know, I work with these people all the time, and I read proposals, and you really have no clue what a day in the life of these people entails. So until we bring them to the table and allow them to share perspectives and really, again, as I said earlier, wrestle with it, we won't get to where we want to go. But I appreciate the question. I appreciate the kind words. There's a small check for you on the way out. And, thank you.
Your last question here?
Yeah, a question and one small suggestion. The question is Cleveland Rising gonna produce a workflow for how we improve economic conditions for people living in Cleveland, which is probably one of the biggest challenges. And the suggestion is for people who wanna know sort of like, how do I strike up conversation, or how do I get to hear people's lives? You can practice on the phone when you get a call center. I can hear people on the phone, and I have this sense that there's opposition. The call center person is like, doesn't really wanna do this. But if you say, how's your day going? Their tone changes. And they soften up, and they'll be more helpful, and you'll have a better experience. In a checkout line, you know, lots of people are pretty cranky and checkout lines, they stand on their feet the entire day, which people who have more privilege don't appreciate how awful that is. If you ask them how's their day, you start to hear things and you see a different facial expression that you actually are connecting. So I think that's a good place to practice. So now about Cleveland Rising.
Are you familiar
No,
with
I'm not.
I did not attend Cleveland Rising, although many of my dear friends were part of planning it.
I thought you spoke at it.
No, I did not.
And this is not sustainable Cleveland.
This was actually a community-wide effort to, using David Cooper Ryder and the appreciative inquiry model that my good friend Greg mentioned. And they had roughly 1,000 people come over like a 2.5 day summit. It was sort of a planning summit around how can we address, in particular, economic development in a way that would be inclusive and bring the community together. I would say, like any effort that has been tried in Cleveland over the last 20 or 30 years, you know, there will be some things that might take off. There will be some things that will kind of sputter out, and then some things maybe never even left the cutting room floor when they had the meeting. I do know, I was at a meeting a week ago, and I heard a couple of report outs from a couple of the committees that seemed to be going well. People were fired up that they seemed to be making progress. But you know, economic development is always tricky because in a former lifetime of mine, I used to serve as the chairman of the Workforce Investment Board, and I used to always argue with our business leaders that economic development and workforce development are inextricably linked, and you can't talk about the two of those without talking about education. So we have to sort of get these leaders together to kind of say, what can we do at the K through 12 level that supports, you know, higher ed, be it community college or certificate training or bachelor's degrees, that ties into what employers say that they need. So I'm hopeful that Cleveland Rising can continue to you know, push through some of those and hopefully come up with something that works. I'm glad they tried it. I mean, you know, we have to try things. We can't just wallow in our sorrows. We have to, you know, so kudos to them for stepping out and trying it, and I think we're all will continue to watch and see what happens.
Let's thank our speakers again for a terrific presentation. Next Sunday, February 8th, we're having a community breakfast here. You can meet new people.